Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we have with us Professor Jonathan Green of the University of North Dakota. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
And one of your main works that we have consulted in the past and quoted repeatedly is your Printing and Prophecy, of course, which deals a lot with with an important topic, which is the impact of the printing on not only prophetical text, but of course, astrological text as well. So we would like to begin to ask you, how did you get into this research? How did this book result? How it came to be?
So I should have asked. I believe both of you are past your PhD stage of your careers at this point, or still working on it, or?
I'm still working on it.
Okay.
I have survived my PhD. I'm a survivor.
Okay. Well, the process for me was, I had a master's thesis on Hildegard of Bingen, a prophetic figure of the Middle Ages. And then for my dissertation, I did a dissertation on early printing on the 1493 Nuremberg Chronicle. And then I got to a stage of my career where I was in my first academic position, and I was my own advisor, so to speak, and I had to figure out, what do I work on now? And there was no one directing me at that point. And so I thought, well, I've done this prophetic figure, and I've done early printing, so how about let's do early printed prophecies? I wonder if there's anything to say. And when I came up with the idea, I had no idea if there was actually any text, anything printed. And then fortunately, the reason that the reason I needed a topic at this point, about a year or two after my dissertation, is someone who I'd worked with closely, Ursula Rautenberg at the Universität Erlangen, had invited me to apply for a fellowship to do some research there. And it was a great opportunity. I just needed an idea. So then I started looking, is there anything actually relevant, anything that's printed? And it turns out there's a ton of material. Most obviously what perhaps is the earliest known printed book of them all, or is certainly one of the earliest in the vernacular. It was Gutenberg's what's known today as the Sibyl's Prophecy, this medieval prophetic work. And then there were a number of others. And once I started tracking down titles and editions, I found I have a great amount of material to work with. Although the one decision I made, what I told myself at the time is, I'm only going to be working with prophetic stuff, none of this astrological nonsense. I'm going to avoid that.
I remember you said that in the email, yes. Yes, I remember you said that in the email, and it made me very curious. How did you, after this beginning, how did you get there?
Because I quickly found it was absolutely impossible to neatly separate prophecy from astrology, from apocalypticism, and all of these other topics that I thought I was going to ignore, and then proved to be completely impossible to ignore, because there's so much of what, I thought I'd found just a nice prophetic text, but you look at, just under the surface a little bit, and it's all based, or the text is pulled from some astrological work. The clearest example is Johannes Lichtenberger. His compilation of prophetic texts, his Prognosticatio, it appears in Germany first, but then it's very popular in Italy and published in France as well. And, about probably the majority of his sources are drawing from comet tracts and other astrological prognostications. And once you start looking into the actual astrological works, you find that they are not staying on their side of the line either. The best example of this, I believe it's the 1499 ephemerides of Johannes Stoffler and Jakob Pflaum. It looks like just a boring astronomical reference work, perfectly academic and scientific, but for the year 1524, they make this note, well, there's lots of conjunctions and this portends great changes, and they're actually drawing on the language of Matthew chapter 24, a very apocalyptic chapter of the New Testament, and then it goes on to inspire this wave of, yes, you're familiar with it.
Yes.
The madness of 1524.
Yes.
Yes.
And then it turned out to be a very dry a dry winter or something.
Right. Of course, the thing about, astronomical handbooks may or may not be correct, but prophecies never fail. And so what I thought was so interesting is, looking at the literature, but, a lot of people have observed that, this flood of 1524 didn't happen. But if you looked at who ended up eating their words, so to speak, it wasn't the people who were the most alarmist about it. You find examples of a few of the people who had said, no, nothing to be concerned about, nothing can go wrong, end up saying a few years after the fact, now I'm going to have to look up the exact quote from, but they're much more modest in their,
Yes.
right. The people who were most alarmist, like Carrion and Verdon, people like that, they go on to great careers.
Yeah.
Just because events of the 1520s were so stormy.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. They just don't care. They will go on being alarmist. It is for other reasons. They will find new reasons for being alarmist. The more moderate people, they are normally not so much accepted when it comes to prophecy.
Right. Well, and then in a way, it's the times that create the market rather than the market that create the times. Because just about any time period you look at, there's someone saying the world is ending.
Yes.
And but it's only really in the 1520 plus or minus a few years when there was suddenly this huge market for because people felt like people could see the world ending around them in some significant ways. There was a new emperor and dramatic change in religion and Turkish armies encroaching on the core of Europe. That's in a lot of ways, people could say, I have this idea of the apocalypse and it's happening right now, there and there and there. And so I guess they can be forgiven for being a bit alarmed.
Yeah, we have forgiven them already.
Yeah. Yes. And do you think, or what's your view on all this reaction to the 1524 prediction? Do you think, well, I'm sure it did, but do you think it had a big impact on the prohibitions that you then see appearing after in the index of 64 and then the papal bull of 86? Do you think that was one particular contributor for that kind of prohibition, that kind of regulation?
Well, let's see. So I guess I need to explain where my perspective is, because I've noticed. When as scholars, we all have places, maybe unconsciously, where we place ourselves, and then we don't really realize that we've done this until we see how someone has done this. And like I saw this, I first recognized this when I was writing about some of the Holy Roman Emperors and imperial history, and then comparing what I had written with what Darren Hayton had written, looking at the same time period, but his perspective was coming out of Vienna, and I was thinking in terms of Nuremberg, not too far from Erlangen where I was working. And then also looking at work written from a Dutch perspective, where the emperors were the Antichrist, literally. And so my perspective is, I think, closer to bottom up than top down. So also it's much a very German perspective. So what shows up on the index or what the Pope is decreeing at one point, I guess I take no notice of it because the people I'm looking at aren't really noticing it. And so when I'm looking at what's getting published at this time period and on into the 17th century, nothing changes. The same astrological prognostications, the same prophecies. In some cases, it's not just the same type, it's the same text that keeps going well into the 17th century. I guess one thing I discovered was never say that anything stops at any point in time, because there's always some later document you haven't looked at.
Yeah, and sometimes they pick one prophecy related to a specific astrological configuration, and they adapt it to another configuration. I have seen that several times. It's very interesting.
Recycling of material.
Yeah, recycling.
Yes. It's so easy just to add an extra C or an extra X or something to a date. And you can see it's clearly the same prophecy. But look at, Robert Lerner's work on the Cedar Lebanon prophecy, for example. I mean, that's High Middle Ages, early Middle Ages, or High Middle Ages. With this astrological coloring to it, talking about a conjunction of all 7 planets. And if in some cases the same text, in other cases the same motifs, they continue on throughout the period. Or I guess one of my follow-up works to Printing and Prophecy was The Strange and Terrible Visions of Wilhelm Friess. After Printing and Prophecy, I thought, well, I need a new book. I need to write something. I think I'll write an article about whatever astrological or whatever prophetic tract has the most editions in Germany that I haven't looked at yet. So I counted up editions and found this Wilhelm Friess tract, which appears in a couple different versions and dozens of editions between 1550 and then into the 17th, 18th century. And I discovered first, it was actually just a version of Rupasisse, Johannes de Rupasisse from the 14th century, which, he had seemed to be a huge hole. I was wondering, why doesn't he show up in the 15th century or 16th century in print? Well, it's because his name changes, and this tract gets published instead. And then there's a rejoinder, still under the name of Wilhelm Friess, but a different text, except that one is the one that has the astrological metaphors and symbolism. So I think I've gotten pretty far away from the original question you asked.
No, it is interesting. It's not, we are not following like a strict guide. Yeah. We just want to know what is your research in this area and what kind of steps you have taken
okay.
in this area. That's it.
Yeah. But coming back to the question, I asked you that because what I've observed, and I'm working a little bit later in the 16th century and 17th century, and you can see from that distance that there is indeed, even in the astrological literature, there's a reaction, I would say, in one hand, towards Pico della Mirandola's text, which is late, the very end of the 15th century. So there's a counter reaction, very strong counter reaction, and then you have the prohibitions, and the prohibitions and all the discussion is always on bad practices of astrology, which, of course, as you said very well, go on and on and on.
Completely ignored normally.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think a lot of the reaction of prohibition, and even a sort of a counter reaction of the astrologers themselves to rectify and to create a proper academic way of practicing astrology, seemed to be a reaction against this this excess of predictions, especially in a very popular level with the almanacs. That was the reason I asked you this.
Okay. Yeah, and I guess as far as that goes, Wilhelm Friess is a really interesting example because what I start off with, what I was starting off with was the German editions, in which Wilhelm Friess is supposed to be this recently deceased man in Maastricht, where this prophecy is found with him after his death. And then in a German context, it comes across as kind of a pro-imperial, pro-Holy Roman Emperor, fairly conservative outlook. I mean, it's, the emperor will be this end time figure who will conquer his enemies and reconquer the Holy Land. Nothing too surprising. But when I started looking backwards, I discovered there was actually a history in the Netherlands. There were some of these astrological predictions, annual tracts by a Wilhelm Friess, and on the surface they looked like kind of typical booklets, but if you dug under the surface, they seemed quite radical, anti-Holy Roman Empire in outlook, and it was hard to confirm. Am I just seeing this, or is this really how they were understood? Were these tracts used as anti-imperial agitation? And then in 1557, the actual, what seems to be the first print of the text I was looking at appears. There was actually a Dutch printer who printed it and ends up getting beheaded for the publication. So I think maybe the connection I'm seeing was there. And I believe it's Franz Fraten. And fortunately, we have some of the documents. Some of the documents that have survived, and here he was accused of publishing radical works, publishing works that leading to insurrection. And here he attributes. So we have this, it's a 14th century Latin text, which has gone through translation into French, and then at some point it's published in Dutch as an anti-imperial tract, and then by the time it shows up in Germany, it's become a pro-imperial tract. And supposedly attributed to this dead Dutch astrologer. So yeah, there's a lot more going on with those prohibitions, with the index, than you think.
Yeah.
And we were talking about the advent of press in its impact in political traits, so to say, but also in personal wars among astrologers. We have a very curious example here in Lisbon of two. One was a publisher and the other one was a proper astrologer, but for some reason they were at odds, and so they published like predictions, and then the other one would publish a prediction contradicting and correcting and saying things that without saying the name, but really directed at the other one, and then the other one would reply. Yes. So printing was also a way of,
if I recall correctly, accusing the other to steal predictions that they have made and have exchanged for some years.
All this in print. Therefore, it was not a manuscript. Therefore, it had much more impact in the reading society. So it somehow amplified their conflict. It's very, very interesting. I don't know if you have some kind of example.
Oh, yes. Several examples come to mind. I mean, one of the early ones is Paul von Middelberg, originally Dutch, but active in Italy in the later 15th century. And he's kind of the bad boy of astrologers in the time period. And so the last leaf or so of his annual prognostications, he would pose math problems to other astrologers that he said would be too difficult for them to solve, and then come back a year later and solve them. Just to illustrate his superiority. And then he, of course, shows up again as a grouchy old man in 1524 and says that, he's being misrepresented. So we have that level of competition among astrologers. And then again, especially between astrologers and printers, so there's this, I call it I ended up calling it the practica, this annual prognostication, this very stereotyped genre, I think it is, a booklet. And one of the really interesting things I saw in there was using the planet children as a way to split up society and then predict how their fortunes would be for the coming year. And one of the things going on there is, well, where are printers? And printers, I think, are eager to see themselves as children of Mercury, scholars and merchants. Yeah. Although I've noticed there were some astrologers who classified them as children of Venus, with mere entertainers.
Okay. Oh, I see. Interesting.
And then, of course, Johann Carion, who's very young in 1520, 1524, as, he's the new Wunderkind of astrology. And he's kind of the successor in some ways to Johannes Verdung. And when Carion comes on the scene, he has this multi-year prognostication, which becomes very popular, goes through many editions. And when he gets around to this kind of a revised edition, he complains and accuses the printers of a number of things, of stealing his work, of slapping a sensational title page on prognostications and alarming people, of misusing the terminology altogether. So he's another case where he thinks that the printers are ruining everything.
Yeah, this seems very contemporary, actually.
Yes. Oh, yes. You can draw lots of parallels between the media of early print and what we see today.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the complaints that they do, like they being alarmist and everything. Very interesting.
Yeah, and I was thinking about social media nowadays. All the voices that suddenly are heard on social media, and that time we're seeing all the voices that get printed and so are heard for the first time.
And even in technical aspects, like the tables, the mathematical tables for calculating, the ones that were printed, and mainly the ones that were printed first, were in general terms the ones that were more popular or more well known. So printing was, well, it's like what internet is today, I would say. Don't you think?
It starts to anticipate some of the same phenomena. And on the one hand, you could say, well, a printer's a merchant and he has lots of expensive equipment, and that makes printing. That gives a government leverage over a printer. You can forbid a printer to distribute whatever work has been published, and that printer is going to take a huge economic loss. And so in some ways, it's much easier to censor print than it is to censor manuscript. And, with manuscript, you don't have to worry quite as much about who's getting their hands on the material, because it's so limited. It's just, manuscripts, whereas print can spread things very broadly. But on the other hand, well, print can spread things very broadly. And eventually you have enough presses operating in enough places that popular literature can become a problem. There's, I don't know if I can cite a case of this off the top of my head, but I'm absolutely certain that some of the very same prophecies that circulate as popular tracts have already shown up on today's social media in complete earnest.
Yes,
I mean, at the very least, some of the prophecies I've looked at have gone as into the 19th century. And it wouldn't surprise me if somebody has updated any of them for the 21st, because it's only a couple centuries. It's not a big leap as far as prophecies go.
And there are recurring themes that always pop up.
Well,
yes,
very popular.
Exactly.
Every 2 years it comes another apocalypse.
Right. Well, and that's part of the psychology of it. Is one of the projects I'm currently doing is looking into this motif of finding a prophecy in an old book in a library somewhere, or hidden in a box, or buried in a chest somewhere, which is something that, Johannes Verdung, he complains about in 1537. He says, I am a scientific, rational astronomer offering these predictions, and I'm competing with these silly, women seeing visions and old manuscripts found in a stone wall, and these are not credible sources. But then this motif of finding a prophecy in a book somewhere, it continues again on for centuries, and that absolutely does continue up to the present. And I guess that part of the reality of this is you can go to libraries and you can find old books and you can find old prophecies in them. I mean, we do this, as academics, as scholars, it's part of what we do, but it's absolutely the case that if with the right mindset, if you come across some old manuscript, you can say, oh, that describes the world of today. It describes the world I'm seeing. This must be a prophecy. And again, sometimes these texts get lucky, and the ones that get copied again and again are the ones that, they came true in some way.
Probably resonate the most intensely with
yes
what's happening at the period.
Yes.
It's quite interesting, this continuous resurgence and recycling of prophecy, especially that prophecy that hits the mark of people's expectations, of human expectations.
Right. Yeah. So that's why I said that, prophecies never fail. You just have to wait long enough, and maybe, pen in an extra 100 years, 20 years, whatever it takes to get the dates right. But wait long enough, and you'll be correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, that's a reassuring thought.
Yes. And now moving a bit onto the history of astrology and the impact of the press in astrology. I don't want to do a very directive question, so I will ask you first. What do you think, in your view, in your research, what is the largest impact of the printing in astrology, the practice of astrology, and the way astrology flows through society?
Oh, yeah, it has. There's about 3 big things that I come up with off the top of my head. I'll probably forget 2 of them by the time I finish, but well, first off, it makes the standard reference works that every astrologer needs widely available, widely accessible. And we see this beginning with Erhard Hartgold, working first in Italy, but principally in Augsburg, where he starts producing these mathematical works, these astronomical works that had never been printed before. And suddenly everybody has everything they need in the calendar of Regiomontanus, and then in his interpretive works, to start offering their own prognostications. And that's another common complaint in the 15th, 16th century, that these aren't real astrologers who are writing these things. It's just someone who's gotten a hold of the almanac and doesn't really know what they're doing. So it broadens print broadens the tools that people need. Another big impact is with the popular astrological works, the prognostications, the practicas. It creates a market, and very, very quickly that market shifts to the vernacular, much earlier than most other genres. I mean, already in the 15th century, that is largely a vernacular market. And it not only creates the market, but it creates forces to standardize the genre. If you look at the manuscript prognostications, or the earliest ones in the 1470s, 1480s, they appear almost chaotic. I mean, these are even the printed works. You would think they would have some formula at this point for chapter headings or titles. They don't. It's still very much up in the air. You get to the 1490s, and it's all being codified. I mean, not just chapter divisions and terminology, but just even basics like, how do you divide subsections? How do you divide one paragraph from another? All of that, there's this pressure to codify things, make it accessible and comprehensible to a wide variety of readers, kind of do some of the steps of reading for them. And that starts creating a genre. I think that was two things. So that's farther than I was expecting to get. I'll think of a third thing, later tonight.
It'll come.
Yes. Well, yeah, I think you said the two I think are most impactful, which is the availability of tools, sources, and all the material for anyone who knows how to read and a little bit of mathematics to produce astrological work as well. And then again, the creation of a widespread popular genre of astrology, which didn't have that much presence in manuscript form. It was there, but not in the same level.
And this in turn contributed to this kind of a simplification of astrology, because the people who were printing, in most cases, they were, as you said, not astrologers, some of them, so they would simplify things a bit. So it would also contribute for a more simplified form of astrology, and specifically focused on predictions, sometimes very bombastic predictions. This is also very interesting.
Yeah, well, and what's interesting is that we can see kind of the seeds of this already in the very earliest fragments, or very earliest traces we have of printing. I mean, from Gutenberg, we have the astronomical calendar. I believe it's also known as the Laxia calendar. It's, I think, primarily known today as the astronomical calendar for 1448. So in some cases, it was an older calendar, and that some of the original work on it had dated it then earlier. Today it's dated a bit later, so I'd have to look up the research, but the realization was that with this work, and even though it's for an earlier year, it could be updated, it could be used by an amateur astrologer to create predictions for future years. So even in our very earliest fragments of printing, we have this movement towards broadening access to tools and to prediction.
Yes.
You wanted to ask?
Oh, I have something here that when I was researching about your work, it's the first Copernican astrologer.
Oh, right.
Andreas Aurifaber. And I found it very interesting. Could you just quickly say a word about this?
Yes. That was the project where I destroyed tens of thousands of dollars worth of economic value. While I was working on some other project. Looking up, I forget I was looking up as many other works as I could find by one of these astrologers, and I came across an auction catalog. This was about 10 years ago. It was an auction catalog that had one of these practicas listed for sale for like $75,000. And this is an 8-leaf booklet. I mean, yes, it's the 16th century, but I didn't see it being quite as that valuable. But the justification was that it was the earliest known work in the vernacular to name Copernicus. Like, oh, okay, 1548. But wait, didn't I come across his name somewhere else? And so I started digging into my notes, and I found that, in fact, when I had been working in Coburg in the Landesbibliothek, the state library there, I had looked at one of these annual prognostications, and from Andreas Aurifaber, and the preface had discussed Copernicus. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. So I feel bad, but in a way, I undermined the entire economic value of this poor auctioneer's priceless work. In any case, I discovered actually this was, I think the one was 1548, but here from Aurifaber was 1541, where already he was discussing Copernicus. And so, and that's interesting because, this is like the first new document about Copernicus to show up in quite a while. So I thought that was worth putting in context, and, at least publishing the parts that discussed Copernicus. And so, very interesting. And then, of course, as a follow-up, then, Rich Kramer at Dartmouth, who actually knows the historical techniques. And if you haven't talked to him, you absolutely should talk to him.
I know. Yeah.
We've discussed various questions and collaborated on things here and there. Anyway, he came along to do the actual heavy lifting of seeing to what extent did Aurifaber use Copernicus, and I believe he came to the conclusion that, well, he's mentioning Copernicus, but isn't quite using him in a historical technique sense yet. But yeah, it's just an example of there still are all kinds of things, all kinds of surprises to be found in the libraries and archives if you start looking at some of these strange little astrological tracts.
That's true. That's true.
But it's still interesting that he is mentioning Copernicus anyway.
Yeah. Well, and then he played a role in the publication of the main work of Copernicus as well.
Okay.
Yeah, that makes us think that they didn't see it as incompatible. It's just another idea.
Right. And that was there were different approaches to Copernicus. In fact, it's become irritating to me today how often we see references to the Copernican Revolution and how it left people feeling decentered and alienated. And no, I can't. No, not really, not at all. Some people just treated it as, well, it's a nice mathematical model, even with the Earth at the center of the universe. And the thing is, people have a tremendous capacity to integrate new knowledge into their existing models. And, this went on for decades, and there wasn't a sudden moment where everybody felt decentered and alienated. No, they did just fine.
Yeah, I think that's a much later phenomenon.
If ever. I think people were like, okay, life goes on. And I think also that Copernicus publication was so complex, so mathematically complex, that it was not for the general public, it was for mathematicians. So, well, it wouldn't have this huge impact in everyday life. It's much more like a mathematical problem, as you said. So yeah, no, I don't feel that people were completely alienated or something.
Right, and the then the ideas they get filtered to. I mean, they get filtered down to people, but again, that filter makes things compatible, comprehensible for them. Right.
Yeah. But and what you said earlier, that there are still these little informations that we can come across in an archive, even in a printed edition or even manuscript, which is, I think, one of the main drives of research, which is to read these texts, which sometimes are quoted, cited, that they circulate, they are known, but I think sometimes people didn't read them close enough to spot these little treasures in them. And I think that happens a lot, and I've came across that a lot of times. People reference the works, and you would think, from the point of view of a PhD researcher, oh, that's already studied, people have already identified the text, and then you go and see, and not at all, they haven't read it, and then suddenly you start reading it, and things pop up that are much value to research and to further research.
Yeah, well, even as scholars, we are liable to have accepted wisdom or something that everybody knows. And it's much easier to just go along with that, because otherwise you have to read sometimes very long, dense works, sometimes only available in manuscript, often in Latin or some awkward language in some horrible script.
Yeah,
indeed.
Story of our lives.
Yeah.
Yeah. So about could you tell us a little about your future plans for investigation?
Okay. Well, yes. So I have one project coming towards coming into print hopefully soon, on a mostly different topic. Howard Luthen at the University of Minnesota, he approached me a few years ago and said, what we need for teaching undergraduates, we need a translation of Maximilian's Teuerdank, which was, Teuerdank wanted his life presented as a heroic epic in the manner of the medieval books of heroes. And he had several courtiers who then composed that for him. And so on the one hand, it's presents a very interesting insight into the life of Maximilian and the status of the empire and a lot of other interesting issues in the early 16th century. On the other hand, it's like 118 chapters all about what a wonderful person Teuerdank is and how he overcomes every obstacle and is victorious in every battle and is never scared, and it's awful. And it's hard to read without wishing that one time at least he would just fall off the cliff, or there's very little character development. He's very much the same beginning, middle, and end. Still fun work and valuable for teaching. So the translation is done, and we're working on we're getting the rest of the introductory material finished so we can get that published soon. Does astrology play a role there? Well, the interesting thing is that, of course, with Maximilian, astrology was very much a thing for him. In this particular text, it's there, but it's very subtle. You have to know what you're looking for. There's three principal villains, and I believe it's Neidelhart, who's kind of the oldest and wisest, at least the most cunning of these villains. And on a number of occasions, he shows himself to be more skilled in predicting the weather than anyone else, and he's more knowledgeable of medicine than even doctors. And what seems to be going on is he'll take a look at the sky. And that's it's not books or experience or anything else. What gives him the clues he needs is his villain, so he can hatch these plots against. Toyodonk, the hero, is seems to be a knowledge of astrology and predictions, and he's constantly having these moments of complete frustration because none of his plans are working. And at one point he remarks that all of the planets must be exerting their influence on behalf of Toyodonk. So even in a text like that, astrology it plays its role. It's just it's not an esoteric part of the culture. It's just kind of a matter of fact. Yeah. And that's one of those surprising things that you come across is I remember in one astrologer or the other remarking at one point, well, of course everyone knows that astrology is valid. I mean, we can see that the tides move in accordance with the phases of the moon, and everyone knows that a hurt horse that's left in moonlight won't recover. Thinking, what? But everybody knows this.
Oh, really?
Apparently, and you could just cite this as some fact that everybody accepted.
Yeah, they had interesting things.
Yeah, that's a recurring theme. That if you or a sick person under the moonlight would not recover, or it would have difficulty in recover. Something that pops up.
Well, this is a good tip in these times of pandemic. That's a really good tip.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other upcoming project, I'm still uncertain. Sometimes you think it's a book, it turns into a footnote. Sometimes you think it's a footnote, it turns into a book. Where this is working on a presentation that should have happened in September, but we know what has happened to all our travel plans. But it looks like the next conference presentation, whenever conditions permit, will be on this motif I mentioned of old books, prophecies in old books that are being rediscovered. And what's interesting about that is the insights that offers in as far as fairly normal people and what the values they attribute to books and what they think they can find in books. And what I think is so interesting about this is the fairly common people with basic levels of education still participate in intellectual currents when it comes to collecting books or thinking about old books. We have an academic scholarly discourse, and we have a kind of a wealthy, prosperous collector's discourse, but we also have this, discourse of the common people where they still attribute many of the same qualities and functions to old books. So that's what else is on the horizon.
That's interesting.
Oh, we'll be looking forward for your published results.
and we will leave the links of the publishing that you already have in the description of this podcast, so people can know a little more of your work.
And well, I think we don't want to keep the conversation too long. I think we covered very interesting topics. Yes, very interesting topics. And thank you very much for presenting and sharing with us.
I've very much enjoyed the conversation and talking to both of you. I mean, we love to talk about ourselves,
Yeah, and
interesting,
the work we do,
it's
always interesting.
And it's very, very good. Yes.
Well, again, thank you very much. And we hope to see you in the future in another podcast.
Okay, that'd be great.